Good evening and welcome to the Canberra AWS User Group for April 2021. We've managed to screw up the mute on that again. Classic JJ, I'll leave him on the production desk for one night. Anyway, I'd like to begin the evening by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're presenting from, the Ngunnawal tribe, and pay my respects to their elders, both past and present. So this evening, let's have a look at the agenda. We've got the guys from Tupai in town who are going to be talking to us all things CDK and some of the things that they've been building. So always great to see some experiences from people who aren't us using some of the tooling. We'll do our usual run through of what's new in AWS this month, talking to new features and updates. We're going to talk to white papers and we're going to talk to training courses that have been updated as well, just to keep you in the loop of what's going on in the AWS world. As always, I like to draw our attention back to our YouTube channel. If you're not subscribed to it, I would very much so love for you to go and subscribe right now. I'll wait. No, I won't. But really great place to grab all of our recordings. So everything from March last year, every session in full, on demand for you to grab and watch whenever you want. So go and search for us on YouTube at Canberra AWS User Group and subscribe. So what's been happening? And I've just realised I left March on that slide. It's April this month, but the number is correct. We've had 183 new feature updates and releases throughout this month. A couple of years into this, you think I'd got it, so now JJ's made a mistake tonight, and so have I. We're on fire. So for those of you who like charts, that looks a little bit like this. So you can see we're still running at a pretty high cadence. And these are some of the ones I wanted to talk to you about this month. So firstly, a couple of Sydney-specific updates. First of all, AWS Direct Connect has announced MaxSec encryption for dedicated 10 gig and 100 gig connections in specific locations. So in Australia, if you're working with the Direct Connect location through Equinix in Sydney, then you've got the option of going and enabling the MaxSec connection on those 100 gig connections in Direct Connect. So this is really good if you want to ensure that you've got that additional layer of security and encryption across your Direct Connect connection into AWS. The second one that I want to talk about is AWS Cloud Shell is now available in Mumbai, Sydney, and Frankfurt. So Cloud Shell is a web-based terminal where you can run commands from CLIs, but doing it in a web browser. It assumes the identity that you're logged into the AWS console as, and it gives you the ability to install libraries and components, and anything that is stored in your home directory will persist from one session to the next. So this means you can set up a terminal with all of your favorite tools and presets and shortcuts. My personal favorite, I've got my Z shell configured with power level 10K for my nice little UI and then tooling there. So I can open that and run it in a browser. I don't need to have a specific terminal client installed. I don't need to SSH to anything. I don't even need to worry about additional authentication. So Cloud Shell is a really great way to start using more CLI tooling and doing it from the web browser. All right, other new feature updates that have come into AWS through April. Amazon Route 53 Resolver DNS Firewall has been released. So this is a feature for our Route 53 Resolver that you can essentially limit the domains that it will respond to for DNS queries. So if you want to block known malicious domain names from being resolved, or to whitelist specific domain names so that you can be very particular about what you will allow to be resolved from those endpoints, this is a really great way to then dial up security, because if you can't resolve a domain name to find the IP address, then you don't know where to go and communicate to. So this is a really great way to beef up security around your DNS in your VPCs. Next is the AWS WAF bot control has been released. And this is a managed firewall rule that allows you to have more control around the way common and different types of bots will go and make requests to your services. So, for example, you might want to do things like rate limit specific bots to make sure that they're not crawling your content at a really aggressive rate. You may wish to block certain bots that are doing things like scraping your content to go and republish it elsewhere. This firewall rule gives you a bunch of options that you can enable through WAF to start having more control about what you allow and what you're going to block in terms of how bots interact with your websites. Next up is an update to the Amazon Workspaces client to enable the general availability of webcam support. So this was one that we saw a lot of adoption of through the last year, where people were shifting to work from home, and having remote desktops through a service like Amazon Workspaces really enabled a lot of productivity to continue taking place. What we were missing, though, was the support for a webcam for video calling. That's now baked into the client, so we can pass a webcam from your host through to Workspaces, and you can do video calling through that workspace as if the camera was local. So that's a really great way to stay engaged. Next up is Amazon Code Guru has made the Python support in Code Guru Reviewer generally available. So Code Guru Reviewer is very focused on improving the performance of your application code as you're writing the code and submitting pull requests to be able to merge into different branches. What it does is it leverages a bunch of machine learning and rules-based analysis to go and tell you about specific best practices and performance optimizations that could be made to your code that will make it run more efficiently, and ultimately could save you money if we're talking about things that will auto-scale through instances or have shorter runtimes in Lambda. So this is a really great way to optimize the code that you're writing. When Code Guru first released, there was support for Java, and the Python support was announced at reInvent last year. So that's now generally available for the reviewer component of Code Guru. Python support is available in the Code Guru Profiler service, but that's still in preview at the moment and will be generally available at some point in the future. Next, AWS Identity and Access Management now makes it easier to relate a user's IAM role activity to their corporate identity. So if you've ever gone looking through logs in CloudTrail to understand what's going on in your AWS account, and you make use of things like AWS SSO or assumed roles through a web identity or a SAML identity, you'll be able to tell by connecting a couple of dots who the identity was, but it would require a little bit of string concatenation, and potentially, if you were doing this in multi-accounts, checking logs from CloudTrail in multiple AWS accounts to get the complete picture. Now, with this new feature, you can get the name of the identity that was signed on as an additional attribute in those CloudTrail logs, so it is very clear who the corporate identity was that was making the request on every event there in CloudTrail. So this is a big improvement for being able to understand the data from that SSO perspective that you're seeing in CloudTrail. All right, next up is Amazon RDS for PostgreSQL now has integration with AWS Lambda. So Lambda is our serverless compute option, and it lets me write small functions that can go and execute and build per millisecond of execution time. Now you've got the ability to take these Lambda functions and integrate them with PostgreSQL inside of RDS, and they can present themselves as either user-defined functions or as stored procedures. So you can go and write this Lambda code that is really testable and scalable and is going to do processing away from your main RDS instance. So essentially freeing up some of the compute capability on your RDS instance and run that in Lambda functions, but still aggregate it all together to present results back to clients who are querying your database. So this is a really great way to provide complex extensions into the managed RDS environment. Next one is the availability of support for AWS SSO and assume role support with MFA tokens in the AWS Toolkit for Visual Studio and for Visual Studio Code. So one of the things, if you've used these extensions previously, is you would have gone through a process of setting up a profile in the tools that involved passing in an IAM access key and secret key, which is great because you can authenticate and talk to AWS. The issue here, though, is that if you were using something like SSO or assuming roles, you lost the ability to have those transient temporary credentials. And so now that we've got support for these built into the tools, we can start getting rid of hard-coded IAM credentials and make everything into really short-lived access keys that if they are compromised in any way, shape or form, they're going to have a very limited lifetime on them. And the last one I wanted to cover off in terms of new features is support for AWS Nitro enclaves in the Windows operating systems. So Nitro enclaves, if you've not heard of them, is essentially a mechanism to have a hardened virtual machine inside of your EC2 instance that can be communicated with only via a secure socket. Now, this hardened machine is only able to be accessed through there. You can't access it with any admin credentials, no processes, external applications. In that instance, nothing at all can talk into this enclave, which makes it an ideal place to be able to go and run highly secure elements like data processing, where maybe you need to decrypt a sensitive value. You can ensure that that stays in the enclave and is verifiably unable to be touched elsewhere from that instance. So that way, when data is not encrypted, we can know that it's secure, and you can encrypt it again before you're done inside of that enclave. So we've had support for Nitro enclaves in Linux for a little while now. Now we've got support for doing them inside of Windows instances as well. All right, so training updates. Again, still plenty of online training options going on, as well as some classroom courses available. Talking to things that have been updated this month, there's a couple of new digital courses around Amazon S3 performance optimization, as well as getting started with data analytics on AWS. We've seen a couple of updated classroom courses as well for systems operations on AWS, and the Cloud Practitioner Essentials course also got an update. And lastly, there's a new instructor-led course around developing serverless solutions for AWS. So if that's something you've been looking to get into, there's now some options in terms of classroom-based learning to help you get around that. So as always, head to aws.training for all of the information and links. White papers released and updated this month. Again, it's a very long list this month, so I've cherry-picked out a few to just call some attention to. The first two kind of cost optimization and finance related. So the first one is 10 considerations for cloud procurement and laying the foundation, setting up your environment for cost optimization. So a couple of interesting ones there from a cost perspective to be aware of. There's a new white paper around the serverless data analytics pipeline. There's one around modernizing applications with microservice architectures in Amazon Elastic Kubernetes Service. So if you're sort of in that space of looking to re-architect applications into microservices and Kubernetes is your thing, that's one to definitely check out. There's a new white paper around the DevOps monitoring dashboard reference architecture. So being able to pull in a dashboard that's got a bunch of metrics related to DevOps and how that can be used. And lastly, there was an update to the hybrid Active Directory stretched domain white paper. So if Active Directory is something that's part of your AWS footprint, worth going in and having a look at that one as well. So on that note, I'm out of introductory slides and ready to hand over to the guys from 2Pi. So if you wait just a moment, we'll swap things over on this end and we'll be right back.
Thank you very much, JJ and Brian. Great to be here. We're going to talk about CDK, all things CDK. And those of you that are familiar with CDK, it's just a great way to build infrastructure and deploy apps. And I'm going to go straight in and do some of that. And then I'll sort of talk a little bit more about that. So let's see how that kicks off. Hopefully everything goes well and the demo gods leave me in peace. Yes, okay. So this is the typical startup of the CDK deploy command, and I hit yes to say proceed. So all going well now. Things will start to deploy, to be instantiated in the background, and we can talk about that a little bit more. Okay. So my name is Liam O'Diver, and I'm with 2Pi Software. I'm a co-founder at the business, and we're a specialist AWS consulting provider. And we have been working with AWS for a number of years. And in recent times, we've become very enthused by CDK, which enables complex infrastructure to be built in a scripted, automated way. I will demonstrate some of that, and I'll attempt to give the 50,000-foot view of that from a business and technical perspective. And then we're really going to dive deeply into some of the harder core aspects of that with my colleague and co-founder at the business, Carsten Eckelman, who will join us shortly. Okay, so we've got through the first hoops and we've kicked off the infrastructure build using that CDK deploy command. There are some commands that one would execute prior to that. I'll talk a little bit about those as we go. For tonight's demo, following up from Brian's introduction, I chose to use Cloud Shell. I've quite enjoyed using it. It has lightweight capability, so we'll talk a little bit about that as we go. But since it arrived in the Sydney data centre, it's quite a nice tool to try and experiment with. I don't want to make the assumption that everyone knows CDK, so I'll try and give an introduction about it. And then the infrastructure, the stack that I chose to deploy today is a Drupal stack. We do quite a bit of work in Drupal. I'll just take that through to a deployment stage, and then I'll maybe talk about some of the issues and then hand over to Karsten for that deeper dive. Our team is down in Bega. We have a great crew, and we do a lot of AWS work, and we're starting to see our customers, typically government agencies and such like in the Canberra market where we're focused, starting to be interested in this wonderful capability. We also endeavour to encourage people in our region to upskill in the cloud and express their technical skills. So we do a lot of educational work in the region around cloud and AWS in particular. Okay, here's a snapshot. See if you're interested after this. So we'll talk about CDK. The idea is that you move away from the console. Now, this is not a new concept. People have been using things like CloudFormation, which is very good, but this really takes it another level, so to speak, because with CDK, we can do that in a very, very powerful way. And we call it infrastructure as code, or true infrastructure as code, as opposed to infrastructure as config files, which is the precursor CloudFormation templates. And we're using a powerful programming language, TypeScript, which is really great. So, the death of the console looms, arguably. We'll make mention of that later. So it was first released in 2019, and of course, it built on CloudFormation templates and that capability. In fact, it still generates CloudFormation template scripting files. But you can use programming language constructs and capability, logic statements, for loops, very useful things. I'll talk about even some of the more complex things that you can do and how things have been packaged up. This is, again, some real value for people trying to build complex infrastructure. You can test code early. You can test your CDK scripting code early through tools like Jest, and this enables you to detect issues that may be present that you might not find out until you've got systems in production. So that's a pretty good saving there, so to speak. We'll flick to the IDE at some point as well. We typically use Visual Studio Code in our operation, but you can do everything from your IDE. You never really have to visit the console. It's probably worthwhile at this juncture to compare CDK and CloudFormation. I'll just put a couple of points on the board. The conciseness is really nice because plowing through a very large CloudFormation file is, it's onerous, whereas you can be quite expressive with CDK. And those of you who have programmed in the past, when you see how you can wrap things up in 1 or 2 lines of code and do powerful things, it's very attractive. CloudFormation was, of course, declarative in its style. This is more like a traditional programming language, and we all have our favorites in that respect. Ops people, the systems people, some of our team were a little bit hesitant originally, but over time they started to see that CDK is for them. So we've been able to get the development crew and the systems crew, the ops crew, to start talking more or less the same language. And that's quite an accomplishment from a cultural perspective in a software engineering or a cloud-based company. And the power of a programming language for creation of infrastructure, you can build patterns and construct libraries. And that's, I think, after the initial euphoria around CDK, that's a direction that it seems to be heading in quite quickly. It's big news, CDK, I believe, because all of the delights and capabilities of your established programming languages, such as TypeScript, are available to you: sequence, selection, iteration. If you come from sort of an object-oriented angle on things, you've got abstraction, polymorphism, encapsulation, the gang of four, wherever you draw your inspiration from, you can do wonderful things, and that's very apparent. Type safety, of course, very useful because you trap those errors early, and that's a fabulous feature. We mentioned, I think, some of the reusability that this approach gives and its conciseness. I would also say that because you can integrate this very closely to your pipeline, your CI/CD pipeline, that's a huge win because you can start to treat your infrastructure in precisely the same way that you currently treat any software engineering development that you're doing. So in regard to the demo, I mentioned that we're going to build a Drupal stack. I'm just going to take it to that stage where it's ready for further configuration. Again, I have to be careful not to assume that everybody who may be tuning in is familiar with Drupal. It's a pretty powerful open source web content management system with a particularly good multi-user workflow. It's free, open source, highly popular in Canberra, and therefore it seems like a good candidate for a group like ours to focus on as a good example of what you might do in this context. Okay, so when I finish my slides, we'll flick over to the browser and we'll check if the site that I instantiate is alive and kicking. We'll type in the URL and hopefully we'll get something like this. Okay, using Cloud Shell is just slightly different. A couple of things you have to be careful about. So I'll just mention those in passing and encourage your own experimentation. So if you're going to, you will want to set up an SSH key. You'll need to set up CDK probably globally, and you'll need to be careful to use an SSH URL, not a HTTP URL. But once you've got those things set up, you're good to go, and you should be able to repeat as needed. Then you do an npm install in your local area, and then you're good to go with the CDK deploy. And that was the point where I jumped in at the start of the demonstration, and we kicked that off. So hopefully that's querying away in the background, and when I check back in with it, we'll be able to see that successfully completing. So in terms of the script, I've put in a very simple example of the branching logic. We have the same script for dev and prod. I'm sure someone might say that's not a good practice, but for the example here, it's probably a good case for us to illustrate how you will branch the branching logic to pick one. So in this case, marked in red, we'll demo the dev system. And just to make it interesting, I've put in a rule there to ensure that it only works over VPN. So hopefully I can demonstrate that later too. Okay, let's move on. To illustrate that diagrammatically, I've cordoned off in red the subset of the potential infrastructure created by the script and identified purely that for dev purposes. Now, I'm not using an external RDS in this instance. Within that cycle there, I'm going to create a database for the purposes of that. And the reason is I just want to make it a chunky demo, if at all possible. Okay, so some of the assets created, hopefully, happening as we speak. VPC for your virtual private cloud, security group, where you will put those rules in place, an S3 bucket, a server instance with a LAMP stack, an IP address, the cluster which I mentioned earlier. We're using add user here, not necessarily best practice, but for the purposes of what we're doing here today, quite fine and dandy. And that's the web address that I'm hoping we can use shortly to verify that that's all worked okay. Okay, just to give you a look at the code, and I'll flick quickly to VSC, and you can see this is what a typical TypeScript file where you would instantiate a cluster and all of the assets. Now, the reason I've picked out the snippets is that we probably don't want to wade through all that. That's 300 lines of code. The CloudFormation script created by that is many, many times that, so we can count our blessings that we're looking at this. I'll flick back quickly to that particular code snippet. And again, this is the power of it. CDK in that they have these hierarchies, levels 1 to 3, and this bundling up of capability into a concise expression of that capability is visible here. I've got some level 2 resource constructs being created here. So we pluck an AMI, a generic Linux AMI, and we specify that that's the server type that we're about to build, and we simply create it using the new statement. Again, the equivalent amount of console clicking that you would have to do for that is, I dare say, quite substantial. Moving on, I mentioned earlier, I'm going to just try to make sure, because we've chosen a dev environment, obviously one has some securities around who can access your dev environment, so we've put that behind a VPN, so hopefully when we come to see that, we'll be able to check out that security rule and see how that went. And I mentioned earlier the add user data. It's not necessarily the best practice approach. Normally one might use a golden image in this situation. But again, quick and dirty, just to get something up and running, we chose to use that. Okay, let's jump across to the AWS console and see what that's looking like in terms of things happening in the background. So if we go into the CloudFormation services, I can click on those there. We should be able to see this. Okay, fantastic. We have the COWS Drupal dev stack, which is the demo stack that I've just cooked. And we can see a lot of information about that. These are some of the events time-stamped and the sequence of steps that took place using that powerful and small number of commands in the TypeScript. But probably the most interesting bit is the resources that are created. So you can see the RDS there. What else have we got? Secrets Manager. I think we've been using Secrets Manager, yes, where we store some database access credentials. What else have we got? Basically, every asset that is specified explicitly, and some assets that are implicit and built in to those powerful constructs. Okay, we'll move back to the slides and we'll carry on. Okay, in terms of running a business and a consultancy operation that is focused on software engineering and cloud, there has to be some clear benefits to us in moving down this path. Certainly from a security perspective, one would like to conceptually have this idea of immutable servers that you simply chuck the encryption keys away and no person can access that server from that point onwards. There's arguments for and against, obviously, but it's something that we're attracted to, and where it's possible and feasible, it's something we like to do. Testability of the infrastructure, and there's some increasing support for this, for AWS CDK. If you can vet the infrastructure, the scripts early in the piece, it can save pain down the line. And look, that's just a no-brainer for software engineering, and it's a principle that if you can apply to infrastructure creation, I think it's very high value as well. If you're using the CI/CD pipeline, and I think in this modern era that seems, again, equally a no-brainer, you can get that fast turnaround on your updates and fixes from dev writing the updated code right through to the production environment. And we see that every day. We see the notifications passing through, and it's quite wonderful. Reproducibility, again, moving off the console. The sequence can be used multiple times to create, and through parameterization, you can vary the output of the TypeScript, but the core logic can remain the same. Advantages around cost management. It's also self-documenting. Probably the best way to document work on the console is maybe through a video, but with a well-structured and perhaps nicely formatted TypeScript CDK file, it's quite easy to read and see what's going on, I think, to anyone who has perhaps experience of software engineering. For our business, and I suspect other businesses that are in the habit of writing software, this is the really big win, because now our ops team and our software engineering team, and indeed in our case we have a web team as well, we can start to get them to get through the day and do what they need to do in a similar sequence. And we can treat the asset that they create, which is ultimately lines of either HTML or Golang or whatever it may be. In this case, CDK in TypeScript. They can chunk through that in more or less the same paradigm, and they can talk about things they do and have a common language. What this means in practice is that on occasion when it's needed, if a software engineer wanders into ops land, they're quite comfortable perhaps with how the ops people are doing it, and vice versa. When a systems person is dealing with the software engineering team, it's not, there's not a big gap in terms of mutual understanding. Okay, I'll give you just a taster for some of the tools that we use. Obviously VSC, which we've seen, GitHub or Code Commit. I think we'll make extensive usage of Code Commit when Carsten demos his. Testing tools, the full pipeline and some extras that AWS provides. We'll see some extensive usage of Lambda as part of our more complex build when Carsten gets going, and some other popular tools for performance testing and load testing. Just a couple of things to think about. Should you make the console read-only? It's a fun thing to have a discussion about, but as you saw there, I flipped back to the console, so perhaps not. Drift is something you need to be careful of. Under pressure in production, you may make modifications to the live environment, which take the CDK script out of sync with what's happening in the live. You can take a number of approaches. You can completely collapse the infrastructure and regenerate it and correct that modification. Or you could even put a Lambda node in place, which makes a detection and puts a fix, an update, what have you, out in the live environment to fix that. Again, horses for courses. People need to make their own decisions about the best approach. Immutable servers is a concept we spoke about earlier. Pushback we get from people is about the debuggability of production environments, and I think that's an interesting comment as well. Devs and sysadmins, even though they are using similar tool sets in our environment, they potentially will always see the world differently, and I think that makes for an interesting debate. For someone like myself who is involved in the messaging around infrastructure and cloud, one of the real wins I've had is that I am now free to create my own infrastructure. I've just had to refamiliarize myself with some of the scripting tools that one would need for this purpose. But for me, I'm a lot more independent in terms of my ability to craft a demo system or craft some infrastructure that I might want to use for messaging. It's a real win for me, and it's something possibly other businesses and organizations may enjoy too. In terms of walking the talk and getting this out there from being a fun toy into a real-world production environment, we have a number of associates, friends, customers, clients, partners that are quick to jump on the CDK train, and we've had great fun helping all of these businesses in terms of exploring how CDK can deliver them better outcomes in terms of their infrastructure build and app deployment. Okay, hopefully the moment of truth. I can now go, I'll flip to another browser as it happens, and I should, in theory, hopefully, if things go well for me, we should see, okay, thank you. I will note at this juncture that my VPN is in fact connected, so I can disconnect the VPN, and hopefully we shall see that as a result of that, I lose access to that important dev website. So again, a very small illustrative example of security rules embedded in the CDK infrastructure. Moving on quickly, and to conclude, and I'll hand over to Carsten in a moment, Cloud Shell. I mentioned that I was experimenting with it. It's pretty cool and lightweight, and you can get going quickly. It comes with a lot of pre-packed pieces of kit that will make your life easy. Again, security-wise, less onerous in terms of the amount of keying in of typically MFA codes, and it's usable on an iPad. And I was creating infrastructure at dinner last night, much to the enjoyment of my colleagues. So that's a win. Things maybe Amazon might consider about bolstering it, maybe a bit more juice on the disk space availability and the session management side of things. But it's a great little tool, and I'd encourage you to experiment. Well, thank you very much. That's my lot. I'll mention that I got great help from our team, Tom, Chris, and Felice in particular, and I want to thank those guys in a formal way. Thank you very much. More and more complex CDK coming in a moment when I now hand over to Carsten.
Thank you very much, Liam, for handing over. Thank you very much to Brian and JJ, the team here at AWS, who are hosting this event and having us around to present here at the AWS headquarters in Canberra. My name is Carsten Eckelmann. I'm Liam's business partner, and whereas Liam is driving the business engagement and customer engagement in our business, I'm more involved with the technical delivery and managing our team of software developers and cloud consultants. One big thanks to Thomas, who is one of our employees and a very gifted developer who has come up with the CDK that I'm going to present, and the incredibly complexity of the different scripts and how they interact with each other like gears in a complex gearbox is quite a sight to behold. And yeah, thanks, Thomas. So while we heard a little bit of an overview of our CDK and the benefits that it provides to not just our organization, but to any organization that uses a lot of infrastructure and tries to have replicatable concepts in their work, I'm now showing something that we've been working on for quite some time, and we'll go into as much detail as is needed to make you familiar with the how CDK actually enabled us to provide this capability internally. So I will explain the stack. I will also show you and demonstrate that live. So as Liam did in his presentation, I should do the same thing. I should start the first stack right now because it actually quite takes a bit of time before it instantiates. So here you can see that I am not using Cloud Shell. Unfortunately, we found that our stack is quite substantial and Cloud Shell was not able to handle it, at least while we were testing it. So I'm using the Windows Linux subsystem, and I'm running this in Linux. So because of that, I actually have to type in my MFA all the time, which is a fantastic security feature, but it is quite annoying. But someone told me if it's not annoying, then it's not proper security. So I'll just wait until everything here is presented, and I click the yes, and I will explain to you in a few minutes what we are doing here. So first, talking about what are we trying to achieve with this CDK that you're about to see. We have been developing over almost 10 years a business framework, programming framework in PHP, which we call CM5. It is open source. You can find it on GitHub. It's for everyone to use and download. Mostly we use it in our work, and we have over 20 clients where we have used this framework to deliver bespoke business solutions for them. It is made for business and made for rapid development of business applications, but it is a PHP web application framework, and in this regards, it is quite monolithic. And in terms of the cloud adoption journey, I think it's far removed from where we want to be, having everything as Lambda functions and API calls and serverless services. Does rely on a server, it does rely on a SQL database, it does rely on a config file that's on the server, and certain trappings of these monolithic, should I say, old school web applications. But we can deliver business applications quite quickly with this framework. One of the business applications that we've developed basically for ourselves internally, eating our own dog food, so to speak, is Cosine, which is a customer relationship management system, or a CRM, which we use internally to do all our contact database management, all our project management, our quoting, invoicing, collecting of time spent on projects, and also we use an HR component in there. We manage our hosting operations. We host over 80 client sites for people, and this is all managed within this Cosine framework that we've built. And it does make things quite important for us that we can update this framework easily, but also because it is a product and we have clients that are using Cosine in their own businesses, that we can deploy this Cosine monolithic structure for them in a repeatable way, especially when update time comes. And I dare say PHP actually goes through a quick update cycle, lifetime cycle. So we've been trying to do this for a number of years. The first iteration of automating a Cosine CM5 deployment was done in Bash. We have a Bash script that can grab files from a GitHub repository, put them in the right folder on a server, and do certain things. But it was clunky, it was hard to maintain, and it still needed a lot of expertise for people to actually really run that, and it got very old very quickly with updates to the system, and while we were using more components to componentize the system. The second attempt was using Docker. So we had a Dockerized workflow where we had a build server that tried to grab sources, create Docker images from it, and then put them onto certain servers. And that was probably about 4 or 5 years ago when Docker was quite new, and we had some issues with that, so we dropped that. And we're really with no real solution. People had to manually log onto a server to install software, update things. People would go into directories and hand change things, which is a complete maintenance nightmare. And when CDK came about, we thought we'd give this another go. We have used CDK successfully in the deployment of WordPress sites, where we now have over 24 sites running in CDK-ified stacks. And we thought, emboldened with the success, to tackle our much more complex framework to also deploy that. So if you're using anything in AWS, you love your AWS architecture diagrams. Here is ours. So as you can see, a lot of moving parts here, but really, the meat of the application is really sitting in just one single web server here. So unfortunately, at this stage, we are not talking about high availability. We're not talking about auto-scaling groups yet, but it is something that we are actively working towards. But we need to take baby steps. It's quite complex as it is. So in this case, our architecture is that we have a web server that is a Linux image that is running a Docker container, and we will inject a Docker image onto that server to run. And if we have 10 different client sites, we would have 10 of these servers, which we could right size for that client. Some clients have a lot of usage of their system, some don't have a lot. So we would right size the instance size for those different applications. But the Docker image is coming, of course, from the Elastic Container Registry, the ECR, and this is where we will push the Docker images from our automated build process. The data of the CRM system sits in a RDS database cluster. You don't see the cluster part here, but obviously we would have a master and read replica in different availability zones. That is because it is so easy to do in AWS, out-of-the-box thing that at least that part is covered. In terms of isolating data, using different subnets and inside the VPC with different access controls and security groups enable us to really tighten our security of the different moving parts. In the middle block here, you can see various code build and code deploy processes. These are being used by the process to create a new Docker image and push that out to the EC2 instances when we need to apply an update. So what we have achieved is actually that no one will ever log into the servers anymore to apply an update. Everything happens through a build process, through a CI/CD pipeline. And on top of that, we have created an API using Lambda functions where we can, with a RESTful API, kick off these processes. And in the end, we will have an automated process that will happen by a push of a button. What are the AWS services that we are using? I just put a little list here. So we're using quite a few. Obviously, CloudFormation is what's produced by running the CDK script. Code build is being used to create, in one code build process, we are actually creating CDK and executing it as part of the code build process. That's really cool because it's so meta. In another code build process, we are actually creating a Docker image that will then pushed to an ECR container registry. And in code deploy, we are taking that image and pushing that into the web server instance. EC2 for the web server instance. IAM roles are being created by the CDK scripts in order to facilitate access control between all those parts. The Lambda functions are providing a RESTful API that we can kick off these processes by a push of a button. Obviously, RDS for our database, Route 53 for creating on-the-fly URLs to these client sites. S3 is storing not just the Docker images for ECR, but also site-specific configuration files that we need to store data in between different updates. Managing passwords and secret information is a huge problem if you have an automated production workflow. I don't know if that ever happened to any of you, but it is a scary moment when you get a call from GitHub or an automated GitHub bot that finds a password in one of your configuration files that you've checked into GitHub. We do not want that, even though they are private. It is really bad practice. So what we did was we created a configuration process that does away with all passwords, in that we actually create at deploy time a password automatically in Secrets Manager. And then we have, through the config resolver component that we've built, we can inject that in the different parts in our old school config files for our monolithic web application. So demo highlights, I will go through all of that. I will show you the infrastructure that's being created. I will go through all the steps with you, and we will walk along and see, as it happens, what's being done. So the first step that I've just kicked off was really creating this part here. We are creating a VPC. We are creating the RDS database and the various subnets. We are creating an Elastic Container Registry. We are containing an S3 bucket for the site config. And all of that we really only ever have to do once, because we will then have the infrastructure in place to instantiate any number of site configuration of client sites. But as it so happens, as Liam and I go around and demo this, we are actually creating a lot of those. And Therefore, we have actually created a kind of a namespace capability in CDK where we can prefix all our CDK stack resources with a namespace word, so we can do this a number of times. So let's have a look at the console, what we've created so far. So as I'm going to CloudFormation here, I should see that the first CloudFormation stack, that should have been completed. And you can see here, it's called meetup CM5 network stack. Meetup is the namespace that I've chosen for this demo. Liam would choose a different namespace, and so we can create the same type of infrastructure without colliding with names and using the same scripts. So going in there, I always like to look at the resources, and I'm always really just amazed by the amount of button clicking that I've saved by just running this script. And if you've ever done things on the console, hundreds of clicks, and you make one difference, and it's just amazing what CloudFormation gives you, and CDK makes that even easier for you. So the next step after we've provisioned this infrastructure is we really want to create those API components, the code build and code deploy things, the RESTful endpoints, the Lambda functions. Again, we only have to do this once, but we created a secondary stack for that, so that it's not tied in CloudFormation to the database. So we can actually do away with it and do not lose our RDS database, which holds all our client data. That's something to take into account, I guess, if you do CloudFormation or CDK. How do you apportion your CDK scripts so that they are not being automatically destroyed with all your data if you destroy that? So let me just go to my command line here. So that's all done. So the next thing I want to do is CDK deploy. And this time I do the CM5 API stack. And again, I will put in my MFA code. So as you can see already here, it is creating a lot of Lambda things, a Lambda push image and other resources. And I will show you those in a minute as we go through. Creating Lambdas is actually not such a long process, so we can watch this as it happens. So going into the stacks here, we see we now have a meetup CM5 API stack, and we can watch the resources being built as it happens. Create in process. That takes a bit. Oh, okay. Well, still working. While we're going through this, maybe I'll show you some of the GitHub repositories that we're using. So we're using a mixture of GitHub and code commit. We do like code commit, and we use it when it's necessary. But because we run 3 different divisions, and Liam quickly touched on that, we run a web developer division, we run the software development division, and the cloud operatives. And GitHub is for us a better fit to have a centralized repository for all our code across these 3 divisions. And it works quite well interacting with CDK and other AWS resources. But we do use code commit where it makes more sense to have that in this AWS account at that point in time of the build process. So don't want to discount that at all. So now we can see some resources being built. So where are the stacks that we are looking at? So the first stack was the CI/CD stack that is building the network and the API. And you can see that in the bin directory. This is where usually TypeScript CDK lives. So here you can see already that we have the power of a proper programming language at hand. We can read environment variables and do things according to those. We can also create, for instance, here namespace is something that is inherent into this particular setup. And then as we go here, we can see that we have a class called network stack, and we have a class called API stack, which are, the CDK for that is actually in different files, which makes it much easier for us to maintain those as software developers. This is something that is not easy to be done in CloudFormation, I believe. So that really makes it easy for us to bundle a lot of different stacks into one script and call that from the command line. So let's go back to some of the things that have been built. So this CloudFormation is now complete. So now we should be able to go to our Lambda and see a bunch of Lambda functions. And you can see them at the top here already. But actually in the console is really cool to filter by name. So if I do that, I get everything that has been created with meetup at the front, which is my namespace. And you can see that all these Lambda functions are being used by our automated process later on to be called to create images, push them to the web servers, and provision the application, especially after updates and so forth. So let's go and do the next bit. Let's see what that is. So in this step, we have created the Lambda functions and the code build and code deploy mechanisms in our AWS environment. The next step is to build the site-specific web servers, the Route 53 entries for that, and the image registry in ECR, and also to push a site configuration file into the site config bucket. So all of that I'm doing now is being done per client side. So if we have 10 clients, we would issue that 10 times to set up a new client, which will provision that particular infrastructure. And because that is being done by a Lambda function, we actually have to now create CDK on the fly being executed by a Lambda function to create infrastructure. And this happens not in the Lambda function, but it is actually we are using or abusing a code build for this. So let me have a look how that works. So I'm usually, because the Lambda functions are creating a RESTful interface, the vision is to be executing those via our integrated central hosting management system. But for now, for demo purposes, we have created a set of Python scripts that are enabling us to demo that here. So let me just quickly do that. So going into test client, and I can now go Python CLI py, and I would have to set up a new site, and I give the site a name like meetup demo. And as you can see, that's using my namespace meetup, which is coming from a different configuration file. And I have to put in my MFA code again, because it is using AWS infrastructure. And it should come back immediately because it is really just executing a Lambda function. But what this Lambda function now does is something that we can inspect when we go to the code build that is now being kicked off by this. So let's go to code build and have a look at what's going on here. So here we can see that there's a code build process called meetup CM5 new site, and it is currently in progress. And something that I think is incredibly cool is the tail logs. And I watched this with incredible joy to see what is actually happening here in code build. It's actually almost better than watching television or Netflix. What's going on here is actually it's creating an environment to issue AWS CDK code, and then that CDK code gets executed and creating our infrastructure. And all of this happens because I sent a RESTful API request to an API gateway that instantiated a Lambda function. It's just incredible. And you know, in the past, you would have used maybe Boto3 or other AWS API calls from within your application to create this infrastructure. But CDK is so much better in expressing the infrastructure that you're building that it makes sense for us to just kick off a CDK script in code build. So here you can actually see that we are running npm to install CDK, and then we are calling npx CDK deploy to deploy our stack. And where is the stack? So it's not in the CI/CD code repository because that's something that we only ever call once. It is not in the config, which is a configuration setting that potentially we should only ever have once, but sometimes, you know, reality, you do have that twice or three times, depending on different client needs. It is actually in this repository called CI/CD site. And what code build does is it pulls down this repository and then executes the CDK that is in here. So here you will see the CM5 site TypeScript, and that is the CDK that is actually getting called. So it is creating a CM5 site stack. And again, that CM5 site stack is a library that we have in the code. Thomas loves to create very modular code, which is incredible. And here we go, we have our CM5 stack that creates everything that we need. Executable groups, we have a Route 53 hosted zone here. We are getting the proper VPC that we need. We are creating server deployment groups and all kinds of things that are needed. We are creating secrets here. So for instance, here we are creating database credentials. No one will ever see that secret until it's actually needed. Same with the admin user login credentials. No more admin in this application. I don't know if you've seen that, but so many monolithic web frameworks have admin as their default user. And I have seen production environments where that was never changed. So we don't have that. Every password for the admin user is automatically created on the fly. Let's go back to our code build and see how far that's gone. We are now seeing that it's creating an EC2 instance, which is the Linux server that is holding the Docker container, where we will then inject the Docker image. But we haven't built that image yet, so it's really just a shell sitting there ready to accept the application Docker image. So that takes a bit, but luckily in the end, where we want to go, we don't see that. It just happens, and we will hopefully get a notification half an hour later that everything is done for you. So going back to my presentation. So this step is now creating one of those web servers here. And if we run this more often, we obviously get the other web servers after that. So after we've done that, we really want to push an image. Probably I have to go back to that slide here where we say we have a new site and then we push the image to the site. So these are two separate steps, because push image is a step that new site is something, again, that you do only once for a client, but push image is something that you do every time you have a code update. So you either have a new feature, then you need to create a new Docker image to push into that server, or you have a hotfix or bug fix, then again, you need to use push image to push that image to the ECR site and then deploy it to the server. So let's have a look at that. That still takes a bit. So let's go back to the presentation. Going to our config resolver. So the issue we have is we have a lot of configuration items that are secret. We have the database secret, we have the admin user secret, we have an email secret, we have potentially secrets for interacting with third-party systems, if that's a requirement. So many secrets, all of these are stored in config files, because that's a secure way to store it apparently, but they're not secure if they're stored in a repository, and definitely not if that repository is used for more than one client. So where do you put all of those? We put them into Secrets Manager, and we have a resolver that is being called at the code build time to pop these things from Secret Manager and put them into the config file, injecting them, merging the config file with the schema, with the data from Secrets Manager, and then baking them into the Docker image. And that is then deployed to the application. The next step, obviously, I talked about that with Brian. Next step, obviously, is that we will change our application to pull it directly from Secrets Manager. But that is a step that we haven't done yet, because we still want to use the application outside the AWS environment as well. So we are actually having a pretty much AWS agnostic application that can still be deployed somewhere else, but we are using Secrets Manager and AWS concepts as we deploy it into the AWS environment. So the way you can think about the Secrets Manager or the config resolver is that you have a schema that defines certain secret keys, which you can then use in all throughout your config files. And you have in the schema, you declare a certain number of config resolver data sources, which could be a GitHub or an S3 config file, or from a file system, or from Secrets Manager. Sorry, that's the data stores at the right hand here. And we are then pulling them depending on where this particular secret should be pulled from. It will check either of these data stores as they are configured. Quite a complex thing, I would say. Probably something that has been done before. I remember XML with XSLT pipelines has been doing something similar back in the days, showing my age here. But for this particular application, I think Thomas felt a need to really create this to fit this application and the AWS environment as well. Quickly going back to the build logs here. So we are now complete with this phase, and we can now go back to our command line and create the next step. And the next step is not new site, but the next step is push site. Push site. Sorry, it's actually called push image. Really proper copy and paste error. So now we are pushing the image to meetup demo, and I need my MFA code for this. 5.2. I don't understand why sometimes you see the MFA code and sometimes you don't see the MFA code on the command line. It is a mystery to me. But here you can see, again, the API call returned immediately. And but it is actually doing a lot in the background. So let's go back to our code build process. we can now see that the push image code build process is in play. And this is another indirection here. And really with CDK, using these different concepts of having code in repositories that is being pulled into co-deploy, executed to then enact other AWS services, really transfers power away from the admin group to the software developers. And in this case, what is actually happening here in the background, and if we look at this, you can see that in the tail logs, is that we are actually calling code from the CM5 application, which we call CM5 boilerplate, which is a shell that holds the CM5 application. And in there we have a .build. And this is a build script that is executed in the AWS code build environment, so it's made for AWS. And in here you have scripts that are actually setting up a Docker image from scratch. So taking a base Docker Linux image, downloading all the required libraries, Apache, PHP, MySQL client, all the image manipulation libraries that you need in the proper versions, the newest versions for that image, creating the Docker image, bundling it up and pushing it off to ECR. All of that is now no longer in a CI/CD thing, but it is actually accessible to the CM5 software developers. So now they have incredible control over how their application is actually deployed, over which version of Apache to use, which version of PHP to use, and so on, which is something that was a flashpoint between the system administrators and the developers in the past. So looking at that, still creating the Docker environment. Going back to the code, maybe, the boilerplate code. Let's go to one of these environments, because that to show you how the config resolver works. So here you can see a config.yaml file. And if I watch this, this is a schema that provides the data store definition and the secret definition that is then being used by the config resolver to push secrets into config files. So here we have providers. So we have an AWS provider and resolvers. So for instance, an S3 resolver. And we have a secrets manager resolver. So we can either look up a secret in a config file in S3, or we can look up the secret in the secrets manager. And then we have a secret, for instance, the DB instance username, that can be resolved either from the config or the secrets manager by looking up an index called username. And the same with the DB instance password, and also with port numbers, encryption keys, admin login usernames, and passwords, and so on. So we are now really just defining what are the secrets and where can you get the actual real data from. And then at build time, it is looking that up. So if I go back to my prod here, and I go to configs, and I go to CM5, I now have a PHP template, which is our old school PHP config database. You may have seen that from WordPress or Drupal or wherever. And in here, you can now see that instead of admin or anything like that, you have these secrets here that we've defined in the mapping file of our config resolver. And at build time, that will be injected into these placeholders here. And in this case, it's PHP, but it could be any programming language where you have a config file that holds secrets. So going back to my code build, I think it's still in progress. Going back to my slides. So what I showed you here, I have actually created a slide for that. but I think the idea is clear how we are going to use this. So I think using serverless, using these Lambda functions, using code build, which is in a way, it's still a server, but we don't have to care for it. We don't have to care for a code build server, which we did in the past. Another thing that someone has to take care of, that has to be maintained to pull the proper tools to build the application in a certain way. Using code build, we can just declare how that server should look like, and Amazon just provisions that for us. Using Lambda, we have this RESTful endpoint that we can trigger from another application. We can create these Docker images in code build easily from time to time. I think we really needed to wait for these tools to become widely available to us to pull this off, because it is quite a complex application. What you can see here is my dream. When I have a really good dream, I dream of this button. I want to press this button, and I want a new CM5 or Cosine application being created immediately after pushing this button. And even better would be if this button would sit underneath a contact form for a client where they put in their name, their email address, and even better, their credit card details, pushing that button, and then they have a new CM5 instance to play with, to test, and then get back to us with a big long list of modifications that they want to pay us to provision that for them. So we believe that using CDK, using serverless build processes, using pipelines enables us to get to that vision, to provision new client sites with highly customizable software for our clients. And also in our team, we have relieved the tension between the admins and the developers by putting the code where they need it and letting them speak the same language. This, as Liam pointed out, is really important as I'm taking care of the team. I feel that every day I can talk the same kind of concepts to each of these groups now, and they understand me. Whereas in the past, just a couple of years ago, you would talk to software developers about servers, they go like, I don't care. And you talk to the admins about a PHP version, they go, I don't care. But now they actually have the tools at their disposal, and they actually talk to one another now and sharing little TypeScript wisdoms between the teams, which is really cool. Thank you. It's a bit early for that because we still want to see what's being built here. So let me have a look. So that build succeeded, so that's great. I created an image now. So I should now be able to go to my Elastic Container Registry and have a look at that image. Obviously, you can't look at that image. But let's have a look if there's something with meetup. Yes, there is one. So looking into that, I now have an image tag here that I have just deployed into this, and I can now use this image to deploy to our server. Brian, how are we going with time here? I'm wrapping this up now. I think everyone really wants to grab a beer and call it a day or a night. So let's use one more thing. We call it deploy site. And this time the parameter is actually the ID of the last process. And again, my MFA key. So what's going on here? I should now have a code deploy process that is taking my Docker image and putting that onto my EC2 instance. And just to be sure, we can also look in Route 53 whether I have a URL that actually takes me to my new site. So having a look at that, I should see a hosted zone. I think it's something funky like 2PyBoom, I think. Oh yeah, there we go. And in there we should have a meetup demo record. So here we have a site called meetupdemo.2pyboom.com. So if I go there, in a minute, we should be seeing a live CM5 login screen. Just go back to code deploy. Deployments, yep, that's done. So fingers crossed. Yes. So we have a login screen, and obviously we have an admin password pre-filled. That's from my last attempt when I tested that. So how do I get the admin password? It's not admin anymore. So now I actually have to go to my secrets manager and look up that password. So I just go to Meetup, and I go to Meetup Demo CM5 admin login credentials. And here I go to retrieve the secret value. And yes, you can copy that because I will destroy the stack immediately. So this is a, no, not now, thank you. This is a CM5 application shell. This is our framework. We have user management, we have search, we have task tracking, all kinds of things, but this is not part of this talk. So thank you very much for your attention and sticking with me for this long to go through this production process. And thank you, AWS, for providing these tools for us, and all our team for making good use of them. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Liam and Carsten, for coming and presenting for us this evening. I hope you guys learned a few things out of that session. As always, before we wrap up, I'd like to ask, what are you interested in hearing? You know, if you've got feedback and things that you want to hear about and have people present about, let us know. Leave us messages in Twitch or through Meetup. We always love hearing requests, and if we can, we'll get presenters to talk on the topics that you want to hear about. Speaking of feedback, please do send that feedback every month. If you've registered through Meetup, then you'll get a notification saying, hey, let us know what you thought of that event. We do check it every single month and really appreciate that feedback. It helps us tune the event to make sure that we're bringing you sessions that are useful to you. And lastly, friends don't let friends miss the Canberra AWS User Group. So I say it every month, word of mouth is our best tool to let other people know about what we do. So if you've liked what you've seen either tonight on the live stream or if you're watching us on YouTube later, share the links around, let your colleagues know, let your friends know, and share it all around so that we can grow this community. Thank you so much for coming and watching us this evening. We'll be back again next month with more AWS goodness from the nation's capital. But for this evening, that is all. Have a good night.